I'm so thrilled to welcome you to our very first episode in our new series, 10 Big Ideas to Transform Supply Chains for a Regenerative Future. We have a very familiar face, a new co-host, James George, who is all set and ready to explore the very first big idea, regenerative sourcing. James, I am so excited to dig into this topic with you today.
It's not a small topic to start with either, right?
Not at all, not at all, not at all. So before we dig in, let me frame for folks who are listening for the first time, or maybe you're a return listener, why we've chosen regenerative sourcing as our first big idea. For decades, we've approached sustainability in sourcing and actually sustainability more broadly as a matter of doing less damage. So reducing emissions, carbon tunnel vision, few resources, generating less, blah, blah, blah. But James and I have been exploring a more transformative approach. And the big question here is, what if supply chains could actually leave ecosystems better than we found them? And James, why do you think we need this shift in thinking?
I think you just hit on a lot of the points. We've come in the last 200-300 years, we've built this economy. We've come from the position that resources are infinite, labor is cheap, and we can just keep making and making and making. And what we're seeing in 2025, and certainly for a lot, it's not just 2025, a lot longer than that. The way we build, make, distribute stuff has a detrimental effect on the world around us, how we source that material. And I think your point is right. We've spent decades, if not hundreds of years, knowing the damage, or at least looking at how we do less bad. And now we're at the stage where we need to think about new and radical ideas. And when we think about regeneration, which is fair to say has started in regenerative agriculture and in that sort of space, and that ties into some of the topics we're going to talk about. We're thinking about that now through sourcing, and thinking about it through the lens of true systemic thinking, understanding that all of these elements, whether it's soil health, water, biodiversity, communities, they're all interlinked and they're all interdependent. And so when we're looking at this problem moving forward, we need to take all of those things into account.
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't have said it better myself. I think starting with exploring, and again, we never know who's joining these podcasts. So we're going to start with some key terms just so folks can follow along. But this is meant to be a safe space where if you have a 101 knowledge, or even if you're a really deep expert, hopefully we're going to hit on some key points that resonate with the full spectrum of folks tuning in. So I'd like to start really with what it means when we say regenerative sourcing and why it represents such a fundamental shift in how we think about supply chains and value chains more broadly. Regenerative sourcing challenges traditional sustainable procurement in a few ways. It can be defined as a procurement practice that would actively restore or renew or revitalize the broader ecosystem in which they operate. So James mentioned systemic thinking, systemic challenges. How do you use regenerative sourcing to address net positive outcomes, not net zero, but really net positive outcomes? And some examples of that could be replenishing rather than depleting natural resources plus, building rather than degrading soil health, for example, thinking about nature and biodiversity more broadly, thinking about community resilience, thinking about enhancing rather than diminishing ecosystem services. And if we put this in a continuum, which a lot of people listening probably would understand, on the far left, you have conventional approaches. So think cost and where you're extracting, and you're maybe thinking about that less bad approach that James had mentioned in his opening. And then we move on to ethical sourcing. The focus is really on human rights and due diligence. So these are some basic protections for workers and communities. And then sustainable, which I think has gotten a lot of attention lately. Think about minimizing harm, but really not pushing the envelope in terms of footprint reduction. But regenerative is where you get into truly positive impact, looking at the ecosystem, looking at restoring biodiversity and building equity, which, as we know, especially in the global South, eco-services have not necessarily been protected, but also those communities haven't necessarily been given their fair shake, in my opinion, on how they are being compensated for decades and centuries of the eco services that they provide more broadly. So James, want to ask your opinion in terms of the system thinking required, because yeah, you mentioned the holistic thinking. Just unpack that a bit for folks listening.
Yeah, and just to build on what you're saying, and I guess I'm always a big advocate of $3 words rather than $25 words, right? When we think about these kind of complex topics, because that's part of the challenge, that a lot of the time they are inaccessible. And when you're trying to translate them into your business, into your everyday, it feels like you need a degree just to kind of demystify, debunk what's being said. And it's how do we take less is kind of where the conversation's been up to now through the sustainable development. And then it's now, how do we give more back while sourcing what we need? And it is about that holistic systems thinking, like every decision you consider its full ecosystem impact rather than one product in isolation in a certain stage of the supply chain. What are those other connected elements that we need to consider? You and I wrote a paper about this a number of years ago about supply chain and the need to bring communities into that future risk conversation around business as usual. When we think about climate mitigation, climate disruption, supply chains start somewhere. They tend to start at where clothes are stitched, where food is grown, where rare earths taken out of the ground. It's where these things show up first. So it's about taking that holistic approach. It's also about thinking about it in terms of particular metrics. What are the outcomes that we want to drive? How do we measure real world positive outcomes, like more carbon in the soil or healthier rivers, rather than just focus on the negatives? And sometimes that can be really difficult because it takes time to measure that. It's thinking about, what longer term supplier relationships. It's thinking about it in terms of investing in farmers and growers and suppliers to support that continuous improvement. But why does it matter? It matters for climate resilience, as we've already touched on. It matters for supply chain security. We all know that our COVID taught us really, really well that our supply chains were incredibly efficient, but they weren't very resilient. How do we build that resilience when there's so much uncertainty? It builds customer trust when you're able, people don't just want less bad. They want good built into what they buy. And it's got to get back to that business advantage. Regenerative brands, those who are truly thinking about this holistically, are pulling ahead. And they're pulling ahead with premium products. They're pulling ahead with investment. They're pulling ahead with customer loyalty. So it's a broad, complicated, complex topic. But it is about digging into what are all of these externalities that I'm trying to influence, that I'm trying to bring to bear when I think about my supply chain, when I think about my business model.
Yeah, James, I really appreciate the care and the context that you've just shared, and you've just unpacked not only some of the measurements in ROI beyond traditional metrics, but then also, where to start, those big buckets, long-term value, supply surety, particularly in high-risk commodity sourcing. I would like for the both of us to talk about some practical examples, the most innovative applications of regenerative sourcing across different sectors, key practices, no-till farming, cover cropping, integrated permaculture, and thinking about things differently, like agroforestry, right? Managed grazing, animal husbandry to build soil carbon and carbon sequestration. There are a lot of biodynamic approaches and a lot of companies who are using these key practices. For example, General Mills committed to advancing regenerative practices on 1 million acres by 2030. Won't comment on the ambition, but again, it's out there. Patagonia provisions, right? Think about regenerative organic certification. Is cotton sustainable? Again, another provocative topic. But there are tons of examples where even if we just pull on cotton, closed loop fiber production, dyeing, and looking at your processing in a more circular, but sustainable way, all of these things are ways specifically in agriculture, and then also pulling through into textile and fibers, where folks are already doing some of this work. James, thoughts, reactions?
I guess, and you touched on a few bits there, and I think you can't, Google who's doing regenerative stuff, and it brings you back a list, right? And I think the point you raised there about we're in what we need to be doing as consumers, as provocateurs, as whatever it is, it's like there are a lot, back to our point at the top of the conversation about kind of what we were hearing live in Glasgow. There are a lot of promises for the future, but actually what's more important is what's already happening. Because actually it is the small initiatives, the pilots that allow us to learn how to do this at bigger ventures, bigger scales. So saying you're going to do something by 2030 is great. I'm more interested in what are you doing right now? And you touched on, you think about agriculture, it is about how do you create less impact on the land. If you think about textiles, it's what is that sourcing? What is the water usage? You think about forestry, what are the community-led initiatives that are happening to reforest kind of previously logged or whatever. The big problems is we live in 2025 in a global economy that has prioritized more and more and more stuff over anything else. Sod what happens to the environment, sod what happens to prices. We just want to put more and more choice in front of the consumers. And fundamentally, that model is broken and built on these half-truths and lies that actually we can just keep doing it indefinitely. You're going to kind of the space of, where you see folks focusing on ocean-based initiatives with kelp farming, shellfish farming, and there are loads of examples of those, both in the US and Europe, Southeast Asia, across the globe. But I think, this is a very deep, tense topic. But at its core is what we're trying to do is think about this in terms of how we can do things differently. So we can continue to provide choice, but it's the right kind of choice because we've taken that 360-degree holistic approach to actually how these products are made, how they're used, and where they end up. And I think for any business, how can we tackle the whole of our portfolio? And that's not where you start. Don't try and boil the ocean, right? We need to start to prove some of these economic models. We need to show that there is a market. You had Patagonia there on your list. I have it on mine. It's a good goal, but it's niche. What about the everyday? What about those folks? How do they make better choices? There are only bad choices in a bad system, Sheri, right? So how do we redesign the system to make sure that when we think about regenerative, our products do undo the harm rather than just doing less bad? How do we make that accessible for everyone? And again, it's about taking that perspective across the whole of the supply chain and also thinking about all of those interconnected challenges which get us there. And the final kind of comment, I think, this doesn't have to be solved overnight. These are long-term changes, long-term strategies. 2030, 2035, 2040, 2050, it's helpful to focus the direction of travel. We're taught from a very early age about kind of smart objectives. What is the time component of that? But we've got to give ourselves a break and understand that actually we've spent the last 200-300 years getting to here. It's going to take a little while to unprogram that and get the behavior change right and get into some of these new alternative ways of creating business models to get us out of the dodge that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, and I like your comment around timing because sometimes it can feel like it's at odds when people make these really long ambitions. And even if we step back, the concept of sustainable development, I mean, this takes decades. Like addressing generational wealth takes decades. And so in a corporate environment, the internal rate of return and showing the type of ROI within very fixed time periods, it can be challenging, but it's absolutely possible. And we both have mentioned Patagonia. I had the opportunity to spend some time a couple months ago with the Chief Supply Chain Officer, shout out Todd. We'll have to invite him here. And one of the most insightful things that he mentioned during our panel discussion at Manifest in Las Vegas was all around the importance of data and technology. And so data, connected data, not just data for data's sake, because God knows we have a ton of data floating around, right? But like the quality of the data, is it transformed? Is it actually being used in a connected way, in an integrated way with technology to make better, more responsible, regenerative decisions? And I think in the wake of some of the emerging regulation, again, some of the regulation has been paused. We won't give you an acronym soup of what's out there, but you have to be able to verify claims. You have to be able to, from an operational perspective, have that layer of transparency, traceability within your systems, right? If you want new analytic capabilities for measuring the type of impacts that James has talked about previously, that's going to require that you make an investment in data transformation. If you want to democratize a lot of the data across your value chain, that means you're going beyond tier 2. You're going to the field, connecting field to shelf, especially in a couple of the examples that we mentioned around agriculture, around consumer more broadly. But there are some challenges that exist. So I'm going to rattle off in less than 60 seconds what's Sheri's hot list. I'm focusing on remote sensing, space tech, and using satellite imagery, not only for ecosystem health assessments, but also for biodiversity assessments and carbon sequestration monitoring. When we talk about verification, I'm thinking DPP, digital product passport. I'm not going to use the B word because I've used it in prior episodes, but blockchain's important. Blockchain's important. AI is important, right? When you think about the millions, tens of millions of data points that we need at scale to really understand what's going on and sense make. Digital twinning is really important. And then lastly, I think connecting the farmers, the smallholders, and those supplier networks to bigger knowledge sharing platforms, because we have lost a lot of the indigenous knowledge. It's almost as if we've forgotten in the evolution, or frankly, the de-evolution of who we used to be as human beings, to get closer to that, to get closer to who we were and honoring our relationship with Earth and the world we share. James, anything front of mind for you in terms of technology enablers that you're seeing with clients?
It gets us there quicker, right? But I don't mean to labor this fact about how we got here over 300 years, but we don't have to wait another 300 years because all those things you just mentioned allow us to get there quicker. It's fascinating. There's a couple of stories I've heard over the years, but this idea of kind of microfinancing and financing to the farmer using digital technology to monitor the growth and the yield of the crop. In very many agreements now, and a retailer, a supermarket, let's say, for example, we'll go to a farmer and say, right, I want your field of cauliflowers and I need them to be here on the 25th of May, 2025. And if you get me a yield above 98%, I'll pay you market rate. And of course, the farmer goes away and grows off. And if he doesn't meet that yield, then potentially the retailer doesn't take it. Whereas actually you could use technology to sort of be a little bit smarter and say, well, we can plot this as it's going, as it's growing, based on weather pattern changes, based on sunlight, and actually we can adjust what we pay you based on what it's worth. There are lots of stories of technology being used by that in sort of the global south around enabling farmers to be paid at point of harvest, rather than having to wait for the supply chain to bring it all the way to the top and then come all the way back down. And actually it gives them a fairer price, and it allows them then to start thinking about what's the next turn of the harvest, what's the next kind of crop I've got to plot, because it's instantaneous. And it gives confidence in your supply because you're able to monitor it remotely. But at the same time, the most important thing, not policy, not transparency, not because the customer wants it. You're paying the farmer based on the energy and the effort that they've put in and the yield they're delivering. So there are countless technological opportunities. I guess it's just getting to the point of, why do we need that level of scrutiny? Sometimes it's for data, sometimes it's for transparency, sometimes because the consumer thinks it's a must-have. But actually, how do we, to your point, democratize the opportunity by using some of these technologies that are available?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm actually thinking about a quote from COP28 in Dubai, or was it 20? I think it was COP27. And it was the kickoff. It was, because it was in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. And it was a kickoff of COP Africa. And I remember a president who, I won't name the country, but he had a really interesting point around incentives and microfinancing. And he said to the audience, if you want to get to where you're going, an EV or a Buffalo will get you there. But how you move each is very different. And when you think about incentivizing the type of change that we need, I know that crop insurance, for example, has been used. In the example that you shared, when you think about payment terms, it's a no-brainer. You don't want to wait 60, 90 days. You want that money immediately available. But what's in it for others is sharing that data. You're essentially folding your supply chain in half, getting closer to the demand signal, because that data is really critical. And in a linear supply chain or in a traditional supply chain, think about how long it takes to get that data or that signal back to the big brand, like a Unilever, like a Mars, for example. And so it's really important that technology and the type of advanced data and analytics is funded. And there are brands who are doing that now. They're funding the gap. But then they're also incentivizing in different ways. And I think, James, this is a great segue into when we think about regenerative sourcing evolving, what should our listeners be watching for? Like, what's ahead in this space?
It can sound like the next evolution of the buzzword, right? This isn't CSR 2.0. It's supply chain 2.0. It's in 5 years, this will be the strategic imperative, not the niche. The challenge is it is how difficult it is getting to do what we've done previously in the same way and at greater volumes, whether that's grow crops, make iPhones, create that generation of electrification. We need more and more of this material. So we need to think about it very differently. And I think you'll see things like urban mining becoming increasingly part of the portfolio of where raw materials come from, rather than sourcing directly. I think, regenerative sourcing, it's not a sort of glossy add-on to a supply chain strategy. It's got to be fundamental to it. It's the strategy you need in order to stay through climate, nature, consumer revolutions. It's got to be baked in. It's got to be right at the beginning of how we design these moving forward, because these pressures and these challenges are not going to go away. In fact, they're only going to intensify. So how do you prepare yourself for the future? How do you make sure that your risk in your business model and your business is de-risked by looking at some of these practices, embracing some of these technologies, understanding where you can actually have an impact and a difference? And also, stop making claims about 10 years from now. What are you going to do tomorrow? What are you going to do the day after that? What are you going to do in a week? Who do you need to tell in a month? How do you need to engage your stakeholders 6 weeks after that? Get started, get going, get changing, because we can't wait for the never, never and the Valhalla of tomorrow, because we just don't have time.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. As we wrap up our discussion, James, it isn't just about doing less harm, like you mentioned. And on our next episode, we're going to talk about circularity. We need to design out waste. The level of network stewardship and care and collaboration, it's inspiring, but we also need to get started. So funding the gap, I think it's still an open question for me. Maybe that's a great topic for us to pick up in another episode. But what are some of the key messages for supply chain sustainability tech leaders, practitioners listening, what they should be thinking about in their strategic planning?
Yeah, it's a pretty big question at the end of a very complex topic, which in 20 odd minutes we've been at it, we've only scratched the surface. So I guess my takeaway is be aggressively curious. This is one conversation about something that is very complex. Go and find out more. Don't take our word for it. Go and dig into the research, and there'll be lots of links and assets off the back of this conversation. But it is about forming your own perspective and opinion based on your industry, based on your part in the supply chain, based on the product that you handle, and looking at, that is one time where we do want to kind of zoom in a little bit and think about what can I do differently and how can I do that straight away? And then what needs the industry to change for me to get to the next stage? But having that starting point. So be aggressively curious, get going.
Love that. And the other thing too, and James, you've always been an advocate of having more learners and less knowers. And I think, this requires new thinkers. And so if you feel like you don't necessarily have the pedigree or background or the underpinning knowledge, that's okay. Like, get started. This is an opportunity for you to learn more and meet others. So engage with others as we start to post these episodes and some of the content that James alluded to. I want to thank everyone for joining us for the first episode in our 10 Big Ideas series. Next time, we're going to explore circular materials economy. So if you think about why we started with regenerative sourcing, this provides some of the inputs for circular systems, but the shift is reimagining product design, reimagining material flows, and eliminating the concept of waste entirely. So with that, be sure to subscribe to the Supply Chain Revolution podcast wherever you stream and listen. Follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram for additional insights and resources. And until next time, everyone, thank you so much.
See you later. Bye-bye.